Please welcome our hosts, the Amory Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education, Pedro Noguera.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today on what we hope will be a very stimulating and important panel discussion. This is the first in a series we're calling A New Vision for Schools after the pandemic. As we all know, the pandemic has been extremely disruptive and painful for many of us and many of our families and children. Education in particular has been very hard hit. Across California, millions of children are not in school, and even those who are, in many cases, are struggling. What we're hoping to do with this series is to get educators and parents and others to start thinking about how things could be better as schools reopen. We know that most of the discussions right now related to schools are focused on how to open them safely, how to make sure that our students and their teachers don't contract the virus as schools reopen. But we think this is an opportunity to begin thinking more broadly about how to make schools more responsive to the needs of our students. So today's panel, we're calling the safety in the time of, the school safety net in the COVID age. And we've brought together a group of national experts to talk about what that could look like to provide support to address the mental health, the social, and the emotional needs that kids have. So to help us in this conversation, we've invited one of the nation's leading education journalists, Elizabeth Green. Elizabeth is the CEO and co-founder of Chalkbeat, an education news organization committed to covering the effort to improve schools for all children, especially those who've historically lacked access to quality education. Elizabeth's book, Building a Better Teacher, was a New York Times bestseller. And having been an early reviewer of it, I would strongly recommend it to all of you out there. She has covered education issues for the New York Times Magazine, US News and World Report, and other publications. Elizabeth has also been a Spencer Fellow in Education Journalism at Columbia University and an Abe Journalism Fellow studying education in Japan, an Abe Fellow. Elizabeth, welcome to this event. For those of you, I forgot to say, I am the Dean of the Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you. It's so good to be here, Pedro. Such an important conversation. And I'm excited to introduce our panelists. Joining us today, we have Jose Munoz, who is the Vice President for Equity and Impact at the Institute for Educational Leadership. Jose, did I get your title right?
You did, very long, hard to fit on a business card.
And your expertise is in community schools in particular is a big focus for you, right?
Correct, yes. Good to be here. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Great to have you. Next, we're going to welcome Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, a colleague of Pedro's, who is the USC Rossier Professor of Education, Psychology, and Neuroscience, and the Director of USC's Center for Effective Neuroscience Development, Learning, and Education.
Thank you for having me. Really exciting and important conversation to be part of. Thanks for organizing it, Pedro and Elizabeth.
Yes, we're really fortunate to have you on this panel representing some of the leading science behind the push for a safety net that isn't just thinking about academics, but also integrated with academics. And finally, in a similar vein, but also now working on the philanthropy side, we have Bror Saxberg, who is the Vice President for Learning Sciences at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Welcome, Bror.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here on this really important topic at this time. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bror's scholarship has looked in the learning sciences, and now he's applying that work, which really emphasizes the importance of multifaceted whole child kind of approaches. He's applying that with some real money at the CZI through our friends at CZI. So really great to have this particular panel. And I wanted to start, Jose, with you to set the stage for us a little bit about the situation we find ourselves in. The audience here knows, because we're all living in different ways, whether we're an administrator or a teacher or a parent or a combination. But I know you have looked at a lot of survey data about really the scope of challenges that face kids and families and educators right now in terms of just how significant the challenge of living through school in this pandemic is. And I wondered if you could start by just painting a picture for us of what do we know about the emotional health of kids, families, and educators?
Yeah, no, thanks, Elizabeth. So I'll just start by saying prior to the pandemic, what we already knew, there was already existing structural racism. There's already existing young people who were experiencing a lot of anxiety because of their living situations, because of some of the inequities they were facing, and not just in school, but in their neighborhoods, in their communities, and even within their own families. Then you layer on the pandemic, which actually exacerbated further, as everybody's seeing the economic disparities that we're having for those who are citizens of our country and those who are engaging citizens of our country, that further widen these inequities. So since then, beginning March 17th last year, we're coming up on the anniversary. It's crazy to think about that. Coming up on the anniversary, recognizing this as March 16th, whole states were closing down school districts. And we began to have a series of town halls Tuesdays at 2:00. And we engage people in the school level, within the community schools. We engage people at the system level, districts, cities, counties. We engage people throughout states. And most importantly, we began to deeply engage young people in those communities. And so I'm gonna tell you what we've heard. So we did that for every Tuesday. And even now on the third Tuesday.
Again, the date that you started, Jose?
March 17th.
Wow.
2020.
Every week.
Every week. Matter of fact, the week before that, I was celebrating my son's 16th birthday. And we were at Disney and it was closing up. So as soon as I got home, I was like, we got to go to work.
Wow, we all have our markers, but that's a big one. Okay, so what have you heard?
Yeah, so what we heard, you know, our young people, what they pretty much tell you in a nutshell, and it's a conversation, regardless of their backgrounds or their privileges, they recognize something. They said, you know, we are all facing and continue to face all these unforeseen challenges. Yes, people of color and even youth with disabilities, even greater so during this moment. And so they also understood one thing that was clear, that they made clear for us. The only way we can get through it is if we work together. And so what they realized is that even though young people of color, our immigrant, our refugee, and especially our youth with disabilities were even becoming more disconnected through school, experiencing more frustration as they see their parents lose their jobs, and they feel helpless, they felt depressed, and their anxiety began to grow. Today, actually next Tuesday is their next convening. They decided to continue to have these conversations across the country on a monthly basis now, third Tuesdays now, where they are supporting each other and putting together recommendations, which I'll share some with.
They being young people.
The young people, mainly high school age youth.
How many of them are involved in that project?
Well, the actual, we call it the Next Generation Coalition. Actually, they named themselves. At a conference in 2018, the Community Schools National Conference we had in Baltimore, 5 young people who we brought to share the stage and do a transition of power from one of the NAACP's first teenage youth, who's now in his 90s, transferring power to this age, those 5 youth. And we're sitting at a Cheesecake Factory and they said, Jose, what about us? After all, we're the Next Generation Coalition. How do we create some more youth agency throughout this movement? So they had this plan back in 2018. So this year, when I say they, it was a group of 19 that started the Next Generation Coalition from 7 different states. And we got together a couple times at Facebook, and they actually began to build what this looks like. So this year, actually, they grew working with community school coordinators across the country, implementing new NGCs, Next Generation Coalitions at the schools. And now they're starting to pull them together. Their desire is to continue to grow that, continue to deepen it through 3 ways. They want to network closer together.
And let me
channel,
pause you there.
change.
I'd love to dive in on that. It sounds like an incredible
Please.
youth-led program. But let's start by painting the picture, and then let's get to solutions. And I'm going to come back to you, Jose. Mary Helen, so Jose just said, he's hearing from youth every single week since March. I mean, that's incredible. And the story.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. I'm like, can I meet those kids? Yeah.
Experiencing disconnection from school, even more so than before, feelings of helplessness, even depression. You have been building on lots of scholarly research with your own work to show kind of what kids need to combat feelings of disconnection, and how powerful and important it is to feel more connected. Can you kind of give us the highlights of what's one of the most important things from all of that body of research pointing out the importance of social emotional connection in school? What's the one most important thing you think we need to think about in this moment when those challenges have been so much exacerbated?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking that really important question. I think what, a very large body of science has been showing, for some years now, but really picking up the pace most recently, it's becoming really clear, is that, the very nature of our biology, our brain development, our physical health, and our ability to think and be well are deeply social. I mean, that is the legacy of our late stage evolution and our intelligence. What this really means is that our brains, we don't come with genes to grow our brains. We come with what you might call like a set of contingency plans, right? Like if you land yourself in this kind of situation, grow a brain and a body like this. And if you land in a different kind of situation, you're going to need to do these other things. So you need to grow like that. And how does the brain get that information? It gets it through what we call cultural learning, through relationships, through interacting with other people, through engaging in the world in ways that are deeply social and sort of genuinely driven by the agency of the people themselves. And it's really fundamentally unhealthy and unnatural for human beings, especially young human beings who are so formatively growing themselves, right, to be disconnected from each other and from the adults who care about them, from the communities who are raising them, whom they're part of. It's deeply unsettling. And what happens in our biology, basically our contingency plans adapt us to that kind of being alone by making us upset, anxious, nervous, and losing our sense of possibility. Another way to say that is hopelessness. So the things that Jose is telling us that the kids are saying, those are natural adaptive reactions to being separated from the people who love and care about us and from the communities in which we engage and build relationships and build a sense of self. And so this is really a fundamental premise on which human beings' health, happiness, and good thinking and citizenship are built. And it's really dangerous and harmful for us to be so deeply divided from each other.
Wow, that's really powerful. And I'm sure it resonates not just for children, but for all of us and the constraints that we live.
Absolutely, it's for all of us. And there are ages that are particularly vulnerable, sort of biologically and psychologically to this. Young people, children, but also adolescence is a major period of brain growth and development that we're really now starting to appreciate over the last couple of years with the new neuroimaging technologies that we have, to actually understand how brains grow, because teenagers' brains don't get bigger, right? In fact, they get a little smaller. And so, it was sort of thought scientifically that their brains are kind of done developing and they're just sort of stuffing information into them at that point. And now we know that's really not the case, that the interconnectivity of the brains, the networks and the connections that actually make a person's brain healthy and functional so you can think well over a lifetime are being really set up in teenagerhood. And also our elderly people are particularly vulnerable. They're also really dependent upon sort of the social nature of their interactions to stay healthy and well. And everybody, but especially those age groups, really, really need connection for health.
Thank you. Wow. And so, Bror, I want to bring you into the conversation. You have you also are a scholar, and the majority, I believe, of your career has been focused on research, and now you're shifting into a role where you're focusing also on practice and what can we build on that research. What are can you talk about one of the interventions that you find promising for this moment in time? Sort of what is a mindset we can adapt, or a practice we can hone in on, even in the challenging context, to address what Jose has laid out as the challenge, and Mary Helen is explaining the kind of science behind.
Yeah, and I started my life as a research person, but I really have been doing application work of learning sciences for quite a few years now, and so the last 20 years. So I think of myself as, if you will, a learning engineer, somebody who uses the sciences of learning and development and then applies it to real world at scale circumstances of teachers and students and classrooms and all of that. One thing I'd start with too is just to add to what Jose said. Some of the statistics about what's happening to kids and their mental health are just startling. Things around, the number of mental health visits are up, 24% up for ages 5 to 11, 31% up for ages 12 to 17. There's some case example out of Pima County, I think in Arizona. There was a 67% increase in suicides from the year before of ages 12 to 17. So, the data absolutely backs up, what Jose's students are saying about, what's so difficult. And one of the things you see then is there is this amazing amount of stress and trauma. And from the research side, we know that when anyone, but especially students, are under continuous stress, that stress molecule cortisol really shuts down the neurochemistry of learning. So in any stressful situation, whether it's a war zone, or after a hurricane, or now as students and their families are under such stress, a really key and important practice backed up by evidence is to bring students in, to give them a sense of belonging, to lower their stress as they come into what they perceive as a supportive, welcoming community of learners who are there to help each other as opposed to judge each other, right? And this was a problem before the pandemic, where lots of Black, Brown, Indigenous kids, lots of poor kids did not feel like the school or classroom had their backs, was a place where their stresses came down. And it has just been exacerbated now by what's going on here. And so there are techniques around belonging and mindfulness, a range of ways of helping teachers talk to students and appreciate students' unique backgrounds that are often so different from their own, especially among Black, Brown, and Indigenous kids taught by often white female, middle-class raised teachers. And there's a lot of evidence about how all of that actually can help. One, if I might, one story about this kind of thing being practically useful, because I'm a practically useful kind of guy.
Please.
After Hurricane Harvey knocked out Houston a couple of years ago, right at the beginning of the school year. So all the schools in Houston were closed for like 4 weeks. And that put the superintendents and the principals in a panic over, their state test scores. They were 4 weeks late. And many of them then began right away, as soon as they opened the doors, let's get busy, we got to catch up, language arts, math, go, go, go. Well, one school district, the Nottingham School District, they actually took a step back and they said, whoa, 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 everyone, teachers, students, staff, we're all under stress. Let us treat this as a traumatic stress condition. Let us bring in traumatic treatment, and let us spend 2 full weeks doing work with each other, mindfulness work, learning about each other's circumstances, and basically lowering our stresses about being here in this space. And then we'll start back up again. And all of you who are in the audience who are principals and superintendents, they knocked out a full 6 weeks out of a 40-week school year, right? They had 4 knocked out for them. They took 2 extra weeks. Think how panic-inducing that could have been. In fact, and I actually looked up the state test scores, at the end of that year, they did better on their state tests. They had higher growth than the year before. They got more convergence, lowering of the gaps among the demographics than the prior year. And it just shows, in a very practical real world circumstance, how important it is in these circumstances to get the cart and the horse in the right order. You really do have to take care of kids and teachers' well-being in order to unlock the academic progress and success.
Right. We need to make sure that when we're dropping our brains, which we're not pre-wired, but are adaptive, when we're dropping them into a context, that the context is going to be a fertile one for getting work done and learning done. Jose, this is a great time to return to the story you were telling us about the Next Generation Coalition, which I think is a great example of what it can look like to take this community schools approach of that Brewer mentions from the Nottingham School District and put it into action in a virtual context. So please tell us I interrupted you when you were telling us the 3 purposes this group
No, that's okay.
have gone forward.
Well, if I could build off of what Mary Helen and Brewer just saying, one of the things I heard you say, Brewer, was like this sense of belonging that young people are really yearning right now. Matter of fact, it's to facilitate and create a student-led opportunities for social and emotional learning. They talked about it. And one of the young people said, I'll never forget the quote that said, "You can't recreate a school hallway." And another person talked about they're missing just hugging people. Mm-hmm. So really creating these, one thing that he heard as far as the community school world is like use community schools. They weren't talking about wraparound services. They said use community schools to accelerate youth adult partnerships, to increase collaboration, and to come up with solutions towards more equitable opportunities. It wasn't so much, yes, they did talk about the wraparound services. They talked about, still prioritize basic needs because, early stages of the pandemic, with schools closing, it was cut off. But make it more doable for the family. Instead of every day schools are giving breakfast and lunch, now they're giving whole packets. So they gave some practical ways in a virtual. I think what the going back to the question, virtually, because it is tough during this virtual climate. But
or hybrid,
the big punchline: make it inclusive, fun, and flexible. Let's make it inclusive, fun, and flexible. Matter of fact, and I was talking to one of our community leaders in Multnomah County, who has a community school system with 6 different school districts, and they have a youth leadership council. And one of the things that the young people were saying from there was that speaking to high school students who have become disconnected, meaning that they were connected before the pandemic, and during the pandemic, they became disconnected. The main reason was, even with the virtual opportunities to socialize with their friends, they had just became exhausted with the virtual platforms themselves. So one of the advices that we receive with technology tools is being, yes, continue to be creative, but also diverse in the types of technologies, because that's what attracts them, the diversity of the technology. Using the same technology differently hasn't been enough yet. So they've been asking for using different. It's a challenge for schools.
What's an example of that? What is an example of what that would look like?
Well, they talk about like getting to know their voice, polling tools. like a Mentimeter, if you know of that. They talk about how to use the different
Wait, I don't know
types
what
of
that is.
whiteboards.
What is that?
It's a polling tool that's engaging. You can use your cell phone.
Okay.
They can use the cell phone and take polls to see how you're doing. And they have different types of polls you can take. And you can come creative with the questions, but also include them in forming the questions and engaging their young people.
Mhm.
They have other virtual platforms. They have the Meet Google, the Zoom, the Gather Town. I don't know what that is, but exactly. The
Gather.
bottom line was like, these are free. Yeah, so
Mhm.
you have to think about the safety parts, but give us some diversity as well. And the last thing I'll say from a youth, because during this moment also, what we've seen and heard from philanthropists like Rory, you're talking about, from philanthropic world to grassroots organizations, is creating more youth agency, more youth voice, especially with those who have been historically disenfranchised or have become disconnected, up to the equivalent of membership on school boards. So how that looks from a school site level with a leadership group to making decisions being informed by your peers at a district level, since all the decisions are made on the behalf of the students. Let's
Right.
inclusive student voice.
Right. And specifically, what is the Next Generation Coalition going to do next?
Oh, I was telling you, yeah. So they came up with a great mission. And I say they, because I remember this room of these 19 young people. We talked about what a
talk
mission
about youth
statement is.
agency. It sounds like they're running the show. That's really cool.
They are. I'm trying to keep up. But they have three things they want to do. They want to create sustainable. The main thing in their mission is they want to create sustainable and equitable communities by three ways. They want to network. So they want to grow youth leadership within community schools and around community schools, not just those who attend them, but the young people who may have been disconnected, to reconnect them to education and or employment. So they want to do that through networking. They want to learn each other's causes, what cause they want to take up, and channel those causes locally, regionally, statewide, and even nationally through some of these platforms they talked about. So they're really talking about distributive leadership practices and how they begin to channel a national movement towards certain causes. And the third thing they want to do, they do realize they're still young. These aren't arrogant youth. These aren't egotistical youth. These are very smart, intentional youth. So we need to be trained up. So training. They want to know how to do a search for policy and do policy making and policy recommendations. They want to know how to facilitate small and large groups in some of these conversations that we're talking about. So those three ways: networking, channeling, and training. And they want to grow that through the networks that they have. Our adult leaders, we call community school coordinators, starting there. That's where they want to start.
Wow. And they're doing this all virtually?
It actually got better virtually. So they do miss. They do miss. We were planning our national conference in Los Angeles, May 2020. And they were so excited because they were going to unleash some of these plans there. But I think what I saw happen during 2020, it actually had them dig deeper.
In person.
Yeah, they wanted to launch that in person. It was going to be 4,000 people. So our next we have a family engagement conference in virtually now in June, first week of June. So they were going to share some of these plans, but their next big launch is, we're still committed to LA in May 2022 now. So they are planning to do some soft launch items this June, and then dig a little deeper, grow a little bit more, and do a more hard launch in May in Los Angeles in 2022.
Wow, that's really...
Yeah, they are really pushing me.
Mary Helen, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your work on meaning making.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you just set it out for me. I mean, what our data have shown, working with community youth of color, kids from underprivileged neighborhoods, kids who've been really doing well, right? But who come from under-resourced communities where there's a lot of challenges. We've been following these kids' brain development and their sort of experiences of the world, talking to them about the ways that they make meaning out of the things that they've witnessed, the kind of world they want to live in, the kind of people they hope themselves to be, and really thinking with us about what their hopes and their dreams are and what they really care about. And what we've found, which I think is really exciting from a scientific perspective, but especially from an educational perspective, is that, above and beyond IQ, SES, right, the kinds of standard metrics of intelligence on the one hand and of circumstances on the other, young people who are inclined to dig in and make this kind of complex meaning, to try to understand at a systems level how their world works and who they are in it and who they could be in it, right? To imagine with deep curiosity the reasons why things happen as they do and how else they could happen. Those kinds of really complex perspectives and an inclination or disposition toward engaging deeply with the meaning of things and not just with the sort of here and now reality of them, literally grows their brain over time. We can predict, based on the way a 15 and 16-year-old kid talks to us in the lab about the things they've witnessed and about stories that we show them, like sort of documentary stories of youth from around the world. When we ask them, how does this make you feel, right? What do you think about this? The way they answer that question, not what they say, but the level of complexity and curiosity and perspective taking and sort of heart they bring to that thinking allows us to predict that their brain is going to grow more over the following 2 years. And in turn, the degree to which their brain's connectivity and sort of functioning has grown, which we measure at rest, right? We're measuring, just lay in the fMRI scanner and just daydream about whatever you want while we take pictures of your brain. We can see that the crosstalk is more organized, it's more regulated, and that in turn predicts young adult well-being. It predicts the things we really care about for our youth, like how much do you like yourself, right? How much do you like your close relationships? How much do you think your opportunities at work or at school, whatever you're doing right now, are what you always dreamed of for yourself? How much do you have what we call identity congruence as compared to identity diffusion? In other words, is my identity a whole me that moves in situations and stands for something, right? Or do I kind of answer, I don't know, whatever everybody else thinks, I kind of go along with. I don't really have any ideas of my own, right? And what we show is that the disposition to make the kind of meaning that Jose's kids are making, right? I'd love to stick those kids in my MRI scanner just to make the point, right? Although we don't need to, they're out doing their thing, right? They're fabulous. Is that they are literally
which indicator matters most, fMRI scanner or what they're doing in the world, yeah.
Right, they're building their brains over time in ways that actually make them better thinkers and more happy, coherent citizens at the end, people who can really give back to their communities and build the world into something that they dream of.
This is so interesting because it really brings me to something I also want to ask you, Bror, about, which is when we talk about social emotional learning and this huge new push for, you have to think about social emotional learning. I've seen a lot of schools and school districts kind of disconnect that from academics or work in communities. It's like, we need a new curriculum and we're going to explicitly teach this in isolation. And what is interesting to me about your work, Mary Helen, is that you see them academic and social emotional as deeply integrated. And we can see that also in Jose's example. So Bror, I wondered if you could talk about that in terms of implementation. How can some of this sense of belonging, ability to do complex meaning making, how does that get integrated in? We have to do school. We still are doing school, or we're still trying.
Well, I think one of the exciting
and
things.
Before you answer, I want to say to the audience, I see your questions and thank you, keep them coming, and we're going to shift to questions in just a few minutes. Bror.
So one of the things that's really exciting about the research base we have that Mary Helen is working on and is describing is the way it links the kind of the biology, the neurobiology, with the actual experiences that teachers and students can organize for themselves over time, or as in Jose's case, that students can organize for themselves over time. And what's valuable about this, multifaceted perspective is this isn't kind of a taste-based approach to educational learning, right? This is actually about how do we change brains in ways that have long-lasting positive consequences in students' lives, right? And a lot of education work has unfortunately not had the benefit of grounding in how our brains and minds really changing and how long-lived that is. So, practically, there's a whole range of pieces here. Part of it is, how do you connect an academic topic to things that are meaningful, in the literal sense of full of meaning, for each of the students and the communities they represent within a class. And doing it generically is just not going to cut it. This is one of the, I think, the big challenges of our era, especially now exacerbated by the pandemic and people working from home. And it's so easy to just switch off the Zoom and just stop listening, because I don't even see why this is meaningful. Right. So now we really do need to cross-connect the skills we're after, ideas we want students to master and be able to apply, back into projects, work, examples that really are meaningful from within that community that students come from.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Some of these are and again, a lot of this is stuff that was done before the pandemic, right? It's just a matter of recognizing great practice is still great practice, whether you do it virtually or not. But things, for example, in writing, being able to write about key topics or write convincingly about key issues in your community, about what's affecting you and your family or your peers, and then getting feedback on that from peers with the idea, I'm going to publish this, or I'm sending this letter to the city council, or this is going up on our website and I'm going to use it at a school board meeting. That creates the sense of meaning, relevance, agency, as Mary Helen said, that are particularly energizing in those adolescent years, compared to, I'm writing a piece that I don't care about a topic that I don't care about, and I'm going to get feedback that I'm not going to care about either. And that's a tough thing for students to power through. So that cross connection, and every discipline has that capacity to have these cross connections into community and agency. One last thing I'd say, and this, Mary Helen, comes from one of your pieces, is we actually have to be a little humble and careful about assuming we can guess what is relevant to a student. Mary Helen, you should tell the story of the student who loved infinity and went nuts about that. Please tell that story. Otherwise I will, which is dangerous. So please tell that story.
I like this story too from your work. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll post a link to it in the chat so people can get the article in Ed Leadership and read it. And then at the end of the article, there's a link, and you can go watch the kid say it out loud. I just transcribed what he was saying, so you can go see. But yeah, this is examples. And I want to just say, this is a lot like what Jose's talking about these kids are doing. Like, we just need to recognize that is learning, right? What he's talking about is social, emotional, and scholarly at once. And when kids shift, so they want to pull into their narrative, like, train me up because I need to be really effective out here. I need to write something to my congressperson or whatever it is, right? Then that's how kids really learn. So the story of this kid, he's an first generation immigrant kid, I think from Nigeria, right? You can go see him say it for himself, but he was part of one of the performance-based assessment consortium schools in New York City, which has a dispensation not to use standardized tests. And instead they do extensive portfolio work with kids, which is one way to do this in high school. And the kids engage in deep thinking together around complex problems. And so he's talking about how he was given this problem, which is basically Zeno's paradox, right? He calls it walking to the door. You keep getting half the way to the door. Do you ever reach the door? The answer is no. But he talks about how I had to learn fractions to understand this. And I got fascinated by the notion of finite and infinity. And then he turns around after saying all this stuff about the math, and you're thinking, like, here's this kid on fire about math. And he says, it got really relevant to my life. And you're like, right? What relevant to your life? Finite and infinity, right? Immigrant kid who's living in New York City and trying to make it go. And what we're realizing is that relevance is not, sort of what directly applies in your life right now. It's not learning math that allows you to do your checkbook. So you could, of course, you need to manage your checkbook, but relevance is an emotional feeling. It's a kind of awareness that I can think about this stuff in a way that really feels like me doing the thinking. And in the brain, it literally is activating the same platform that if you poke it in a person who's awake, they'll get like nauseous, right? Like it's the same platform that we feel the digestion of our lunch, right? It feels like our internal self. And then we elaborate that up into a feeling of this really matters to the real me right now. So it's not about limiting the content, like you suggested, Elizabeth, and like Laura said. It's not about limiting the content to like, these kids care about X because they live in, this place and that's what matters. So we're going to give them that for their math assignment or this for the, right? It's about learning to expand the things you're capable of caring about by really owning them as you think about them, using them, getting fascinated by them, and driving yourself through that space of discovery with other people. And doing that is really what drives learning.
And when you
the key thing there is, the relevance is actually defined by the kid and really the kid's own brain. It's not defined by the adults around them, right? Now, sometimes we'll recognize it and we'll say, yeah, we agree, that's relevant.
Yeah.
But as you said, we shouldn't, cut off the possibility that a kid builds something new that they're relevant, that they think is relevant, and make that available and let them pursue that in their own passionate way. Sorry, I went on too long, Elizabeth, about this, but it's just—
No.
Can I build on that real quick?
Yeah, do.
So what does that take for us as adults? That's the hard part. I see the questions in regards like, what's the practical application? What's that say, Michelle?
Yes, Jose, I was just going to say going to point a question to you from our audience. How do we create social emotional knowledge in teachers and educators? And Melanie in particular is curious about teacher prep programs, but you could take that in whatever direction you want.
Yeah, so one, I'll just speak for myself, right? We all have biases. We're lying to ourselves if we don't. But when we don't check our biases unchecked, they turn into prejudice. When we don't check our prejudice, it turns into discrimination and oppression. So for us as adults, the first thing is surrounding ourselves with a group of people who can regularly check our biases together and work through that. So there's some examples of that around there. So what we're learning that school districts are doing across the country right now is actually conducting what we call professional development sessions, not just for their staff, but realizing that there are partners who work with the same children. They're working with their partners as well on SEL learning, even self-care management, because you know what, if I'm a teacher with kids and I got a Zoom room full of kids, I'm probably really stressed out. How to handle anxiety? How do we develop relationships where Mary Helen, I'll translate how I translate it, where we're listening to Matthew and not just trying to teach math. It's like, how do we build those relationships with folks? So that's an example. Districts are using data differently now. They're gathering more qualitative data, and they're using their quantitative data, their attendance, their enrollments, to actually point to who's hurting right now. And what people are realizing during this virtual moment that we can carry forward is that every time we turn on this virtual screen, it's a home visit. So young people have told us to slow the pace down, as Brewer was talking about, when you're stressed out for the 2 weeks of time to actually do that. Slow the pace down, care about more what's happening in my home, put me in a place where I'm super interested now in you also. We now have a relationship. So actually using data to see who they need to do that with more, and creating qualitative data around how you're doing what you need, how would you like to be involved type data. We're also seeing folks working with those partners that they're in training with out of school time. We talk about catching people up. We can't do it in the middle. My background worked for the Boys and Girls Clubs for 13 years. That was my first career was out of school time. out of school time now is from the information that we need young people to learn inside the classroom, how is that applied, as I was hearing Marianne talk about, how is that applied differently in the out of school time place? Sometimes the best place for the application, how do we get partners in out of school time spaces talking and working closer with the actual who's preparing the curriculum? And then one thing we've all learned, we've been trying to figure this out for decades, family engagement, right? Well, we just took away, transportation barrier. We just took away childcare barrier. We just took away, I got to cook dinner barrier, and just have a parent come as you are on the virtual platform and participate. We've seen a super increase of family engagement, significant levels of family engagement across the country. With those places who were already prepared and working towards partnerships with families, the places who weren't, what we also learned was, how do we do it? We just said we should have been doing it all along. So those are some things, some practical, systemic things that could be done.
And one of the things you're talking about with home visits picks up on some of a bunch of the questions that we're getting, which, and one of them is from Heather, which kind of exemplifies many, but really focusing on what do educators do to find and identify and then support kids and young people who are dealing with depression. And Heather asks, how do we find and help the quiet ones who don't speak up about their emotional distress? Bror, do you want to answer that?
Well, one thing I wanted to do related to this question of how do teachers kind of figure out what to do, and it's related to exactly this question of well-being and belonging. We at CZI supported the development of a kind of a toolkit for restarting schools. It is posted up at the CCSSO organization. They're kind of the main sponsor for this, called Restart and Recovery, Considerations for Teaching and Learning. And so in there is a range of things that schools should be thinking about as they come back in and start to think about change, including a specific section about this issue of well-being and belonging and all of this. And it is a challenge. Part of it is becoming more intentional about having conversations that are one-on-one instead of just the big group Zoom chats. This has always been the case that teachers are looking at each student and can tell as they come and go from class, as they interact, is this a good day for, little Jose or little Bror, or is this now an unusual day, right? It's a lot harder when you just pop up in a box and the box goes away. And so it's got to be a little more intentional about having conversations. Also at CZI, we've actually released a tool called Along, which is intended to, and it provides evidence-grounded questions to teachers and students to do video chat with each other about those questions. And then the idea is to kind of repeat that all through the school year so that they both get to know each other better, but the prompts aren't random. They're actually grounded in work that's designed to help increase a sense of belonging or togetherness. And again, it's quick. It's an asynchronous video chat, but it lets both sides see each other differently. And especially for teachers, it gives them some new information and over time is able to tell, whoa, Bror seems to be really not what he was a few weeks ago. So it is not dissimilar to what has always been good teaching practice, but now we have to maybe put the technology to work in a slightly different way.
So that tool is called Along?
Along, A-L-O-N-G, yes.
Along, and it's asynchronous video chat with prompts designed to build relationships.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And the other toolkit you mentioned is at the Council of Chief State School Officers is housing it, called the Toolkit for Recovery.
Yeah, the name of it is actually Restart and Recovery, Considerations for Teaching and Learning. And it's a multifaceted guide, has a lot of really great insights that are, again, grounded in evidence and other practice, and may be helpful for districts and schools looking for ideas. If
I can I add on that really quickly, Elizabeth?
Yeah,
I think also to answer the question you had asked before, and to build on what my colleagues have said, is that not to be super provocative, but I think we need to be provocative. We really need to kind of take a step back. And this pandemic has offered us an opportunity to take a step back and think about what are schools actually for? What kinds of experiences really count as meaningful growth opportunities for our young people? And how can we design our schools so that they're orchestrating contexts in which those experiences can be had by kids? And what this really means, and don't take me the wrong way, like listen all the way through, is we need to get our focus off of learning in the sense of learning outcomes and I can do this and I know that, and onto the development of the people. How are the teachers and the students growing themselves as people in this context? And then the learning serves that aim. I need to know math to be able to think about this infinity concept I got so fascinated with. I need to understand writing and speaking and arguments and historical precedent to be able to argue Jose's kids, for like access to youth council resources or something, right? So kids are pulling the learning in because they have a developmentally appropriate goal. And so what this really means for teachers and administrators is think about how we change the kinds of professional development opportunities that teachers have so that they are really experts, to become experts in child development. This is sort of intuitive for little kids. Nobody would ever dream of sticking a teacher for preschool kids into a classroom without that teacher having background in how preschool kids are developing, right? And we need to start doing that across all of the ages. All of our young people are developing in characteristic ways at different ages. Teachers need to be given opportunities to really explore that development and to think about how the opportunities they can provide and the relationships they can facilitate will actually grow the young people's development as people, much the way we already do for little kids, but we need to do it all the way up to our post-secondary kids.
Shifting from like strict kind of learning outcomes lens to
That's right. So we shift the emotions. Like emotions are, whatever you're having emotions about is what you're thinking about, right? And whatever you're thinking about, you have the possibility of remembering and learning. Okay, so let's shift the emotions that we are having in schools away from learning outcomes, and toward ideas. The emotions should be about the ideas that we're engaging in. The outcomes are just metrics of sort of the degree to which that process was successful. So really shifting the focus of schools and accountability and discussions, and frankly, shifting the emotional experience of people in schools and students in schools away from outcomes and onto ideas.
Two questions that I think are very relevant from the audience to this moment, because we've been talking about a lot of exciting kind of new approaches that are, in some ways new, what you're arguing for, and in some ways, I know, as you've written, Mary Helen, as old as the beginning of education thought and scholarship itself. So with just more and more piling up of evidence from all different kinds of ways. We didn't have brain imaging software, but now we do, et cetera. But the challenge, of course, is like, well, how do we do this? This sounds really great. How do we do this? So two questions. Ed from and I'm going to have Jose, I'm going to ask you to answer first. Ed from Los Angeles wants to know, who has the responsibility for students' mental health, and who should be leading this work more broadly? Is it school districts? Is it communities? Is it counties? Is it states? And then similarly, Lara asks, how do we create change within systems when colleagues or superiors don't seem to be caring enough about mental health or these kind of developmental outcomes? We're getting a lot of questions about who has responsibility for leading these shifts at a moment of so much challenge. So I'm going to turn to Jose, and then after you answer, I'm going to invite Pedro to come back in and join us and look at the bigger policy lens. So Jose, who is responsible here?
Yeah, so you make me reflect on a quote. The student's name is Sage. Sage is in 11th grade, and said, it's not enough to have a mental health counselor and their contact information, there needs to be a mental health center to be established. Now, when Sage was talking about that, yes, school-based health centers are important, a physical place, but Sage was talking about there needs to be a mindset where everyone can have a discussion on mental health. The center is within us. So when I hear the question, who is responsible, and you started listing all the different agencies, the answer is yes, all of them. So, but now the process, going back to Helen saying that the future of what schools can look like, and what I love about what we're being pushed for the next iteration of community schools being around accelerating youth adult partnerships, is that they should be at the center of the creation of what you're asking in that creation of social and emotional learning. So when speaking of Sage, what that could look like, what community schools do, you name another facility that has the majority of its surrounding population coming to it, their lived experience come to it through their children. However, you can use that as a communication vehicle where it pulls everyone together on behalf of all the children, including the children themselves. So community schools, looking at the next iteration, the future of it is really utilizing the public structure of a school who engages at the bare minimum 40% of the year, 180 days, as a process of communication, of how they come together and collaborate, and ideation, as I was hearing you speak, but then the process of coordinating, turning that into the application. And then how does these learning things, math, reading, science, getting incorporated from the ideas and solutions that they are coming to? So that's the purpose now of community schools coming to form, is not just wraparound services. This is around like an ideation station now, right? This is a hub of your community where anybody can come up with a solution. And just to distribute, and the other part of that question was the mindsets of the people in position, where we have these perceived power, where you see some of the greater leaders really practicing not distributive leadership, which is still delegation, where they're practicing distributive relationship like our technology companies do, and say, what is this creation towards us, our greater well-being? And let that happen through the bringing of people together and thinking of minds and supporting that.
You're distinguishing between delegating in a hierarchical manner and saying you have responsibility for this and you have responsibility for that, right. And instead saying everyone takes leadership.
Moving from the hierarchy where this is what we're going to do and you guys do these things, even from this is what we're going to do and now we need subcommittees, to here's where we all want to go. We all want a community where we don't have to leave. We all want a school where we can trust and our children will be safe walking through a neighborhood to get to. We all want to do well in our livelihoods economically, and not just economically, we want to feel good about what we do. So let people create around how to get there. What's holding me back? How do we get there as a community? And let that inform the districts, the cities, the counties, the universities, the United Ways, the community-based organizations, the foundations, go on and on and on. Let that inform them. Let them resource that. That's the hard part Bror was talking about earlier. That's a huge shift for philanthropy, is like, here's some great, we're gonna put our money together. What are you guys thinking about to get you there? And how are you gonna measure that success? Let them think about how they're gonna measure success.
Okay, this is beautiful. I love this idea, but it's also very challenging. And I'm going to be honest about what I'm thinking about, Jose, as you're saying this. And I want to bring Pedro back into the conversation. So please come back and join us, Pedro. What I'm thinking about are just the context that, first of all, pandemic aside, the context of American education is almost designed to prevent anything from changing in the beautiful way you just said, right? Because we all have, everyone who works in the system has so many different masters pulling them in different directions, regulatory things they need to comply with at the school leadership and district leadership level, or at the teacher level. You know, this is the curriculum, this is the test. And so, and yet, I think we also know that this moment in time could be a shaking off of some of those old ways in terms of policy as well, that could make it even easier for what you're describing, Jose, for people to support the great ideas that can emerge from young people, from teachers. And so I just love all of you, and we can start with you, Pedro, to speak to this moment in time. We have a huge influx of recovery dollars that have still not finished being spent in many school districts across the country, plus the new wave that's coming. But we also have immense challenges. So Pedro, you advise, in addition to your scholarly work, you advise governors and state departments of education. What do you hope that can come out of this moment to make some of what everyone's describing here possible? And I'm coming back to all of you with that same question. So you start, Pedro.
Thanks for the question, Elizabeth. And I've really been enjoying the discussion because it serves as such a powerful way of reminding us that, you know, the schools we have now were designed for an industrial or an industrializing society. If we were to have a chance to start over and create schools that would be truly responsive to the needs of the young people we serve, they wouldn't look like the schools we've had. They'd look very different. And we've heard a lot about that today. So I think that the challenge to the policymakers, and particularly the superintendents who are in leadership positions at the local level, is not to go back to the way it was, but to use this as the opportunity. And I think that the ideas I've heard today from our panelists given me a lot to think about. And I'm hoping that the superintendents and other educators that are listening today are also thinking about, okay, how do I, given what I know to be the needs of my young people, the people we serve, and our community, how do I use that now to design very different systems of support? So I think that the conversation has been rich. My hope is that we get some traction on these ideas.
Thank you. Mary Helen, let's go to you. What's the concrete things that can come from the influx of resources, the appetite potentially for change and the policy level to enable this person-to-person human development work to happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think from a science perspective, we need what I've been calling a Copernican revolution, right? In the way we think about the problem space of school. So Copernicus came along, we had a Earth as the center of the universe, and people were trying to map the way lights moved over the sky, and then they didn't ever quite do what you thought. So you had to keep adding on little numbers and trying to fix it all the time to try to retrofit what you were observing to your mental model. And when Copernicus came along, he said, well, you know what, let's switch it. Maybe the sun's the center and we're going around too. And all this and all the extra little stuff falls away. And I think we need to think about schools like that. And I know this is like the 30,000 foot, solar system view, but we need to think about shifting so that the child is the center of our school universe, the community, the family are the centers of our universe. And then rather than trying to retrofit with interventions and extra, layered on social emotional learning lessons and growth mindset lessons and stuff, these things are very useful. They're very useful, but they're only necessary because the system itself is not designed to naturally grow the qualities of mind and the experiences of well-being and of thinking and of relating and of cultural knowledge building that our children are hungry for, that literally grow them biologically and socially and culturally into functioning, whole, healthy citizens. So we really need to shift the focus and ask ourselves, what do our families and our communities need? This is very much like what the other panelists have said. And then how could we really think outside the box to redesign the curriculum around those needs, not just adding extra supports, which are also really necessary, right? You need access to mental health services and things, of course, and nutritious food and all that. But then also thinking about how do our core curricula get rethought, not even the content, but the way in which kids engage with the exercises, with the work. Why do we work as individuals and don't help each other in tests, for example? Other countries don't have that kind of individualistic approach, like Denmark doesn't. Kids, talk together during their tests and they help each other. Why do we have these assumptions, right? This really goes back to what Jose was saying early on about challenging your own assumptions. We as a nation need to challenge our own assumptions about what learning looks like, what achievement looks like, and deconstruct that around what kind of people do we really want to be? Let's build opportunities to become those people.
And, it strikes me that I think when I started as an education reporter, I was probably moderating or sitting in the audience for a panel that Pedro was on and convening, in which just that exact point was made. Like, and I'm sure that if I was 100 years old, I could have been an education reporter.
Can we do it already? Can we make it happen already? We got to be brave.
I do think that this is an unusual moment when the pieces do exist. It's not like somebody has to invent such a curriculum or invent.
There's a lot to pull from. That's right.
Leadership model. And the challenge is, like, how can individuals, whether they're educators or parents or superintendents or administrators, principals, work together to enable that, because it's a very complex endeavor to make it happen. Bror, I introduced you as the scholar turned practitioner, and then you gently corrected me. Oh, I've always been using both, but you really are, I think, looking at things in an increasingly systemic stage, given your new role. So what's how do you intend to make the best of this moment in time from the platform of the generosity of CZI?
So, well, a couple of things. One, I love the metaphor, Mary Helen, of the Copernican Revolution, and then that'll allow all the epicycles to fall away. There's something there I have to think harder about. The other part of this is, we've already been working with organizations like Transcend Learning that are really helping school districts, schools, before the pandemic, who decide they really want to do things differently and they want to ground it on evidence. And one of the things that Transcend Learning has appreciated is exactly this very point that you made, Elizabeth, which is, right now, lots of schools have been knocked sideways. So the question is, do they come back to their original path, or do they keep going to a new and better path? Because either way, there's going to be disruption and change and challenge and all that. And rather than come back to the old rut, why not figure out a systematic way to use the changes that have already been, frankly, forced on schools, and use those as fuel to say, how do we keep going towards things that are much better for the students in the way that Jose and Mary Helen have been talking about, centered on students, centered on their well-being, centered on their agency and identities, grounded in evidence, and make that be very practical. So from our standpoint at CZI, we really do want to be thinking about how do we, it's both local and larger, right? That how do we make doing local changes that match local communities be more efficient, more successful, where you are really listening deeply to those communities, as opposed to telling them what they should care about, and turning that into new processes that can be run repeatedly. And even things like, I don't know, state report cards, for example, for schools, right? Even those could end up becoming more localized, even if they then shrink and roll up to a state report card. Imagine if you actually had really interesting data to the local community about goals that they cared a lot about, and then link those to actions so that schools can now have continuous improvement cycles grounded in evidence they're gathering that they themselves have designed and are excited about. And,
so you're saying you want the consortium schools with performance assessments to that approach to be applied to actually school accountability, not just to kids, but to schools.
That's right. And having it stretched.
Use the accountability tools that you're saying were foisted upon schools, and just change the content of them so that they facilitate a more human development approach.
And link to actions, right? So a lot of the school reporting and accountability right now, it's unclear what a teacher or a student can do based on that report. And so the idea is to make it be more tied to what local communities are really engaged by on behalf of their kids, and tied to actions that can be taken by the community. So now it works up and down the line as opposed to only being kind of a report card without connection to what communities are trying to change and trying to achieve. And there's a moment now when this could happen. One last piece, I'll say this. One of the pieces of fuel we think a lot about are, it used to be your teenager came home and said, God, I hate school. I'm just bored. I hate it. And the adults would just be like, it's a teenager, what? Now the adults are actually in the middle of teaching this. And the adults are looking at it saying, my God, this really is boring. This really is irrelevant. And suddenly you have new fuel around, we got to make some changes. And that's a piece that districts and schools can potentially use to explain why are we making changes? Because now the parents can be more like, oh yeah, you got to make some changes.
That's really funny that you say that. I remember when there was a circulating article and maybe series of articles by a teacher saying, I sat in this, I've shadowed students. I was a student for 24 hours and I wanted to go insane. I was a student at my own high school and I wanted to go insane. And actually now this whole experience is putting a lot more people in those shoes than ever bargained on it. So Jose, you're up next. It sounds, what Brewer is outlining is quite similar to the framework you started us out with of community schools can be at the center of kind of designing new focused and like very motivated objectives that then kind of grow out of there and then others will follow along. Isn't that in practice just so hard? I mean, I know we've reported at Chalkbeat on a lot of some incredible community schools that just get completely caught up in the bureaucracy that's imposed upon them. So if you were king of the world for the next year, what could federal and state actors do to make that kind of bottom-up change more possible?
You had me if I was king of the world for the next year. And I forgot the rest of the question. No, just kidding. All right, so a little background on me. I'm the youngest. I have I was raised by my mom and my 3 older sisters, and I have my wife and my 3 daughters. I've never been king of the world. I was like, I could be the king of the world for the year. What everybody said is so rich, and so my challenge was responding to that as concise as I can be. It's not as hard as we think it is. It's not so much building upon what Helen was saying, that we're looking to produce more leaders. What we want to do is activate leadership across entire communities and building upon where Brewer, we got to get together. We're building upon where Brewer is saying early on in my current position as the director of the coalition, I had a conversation with the scientists about critical mass. And Brewer mentioned the word efficiency and effectiveness. And if you think about the multiple streams of funding, who do they go to? Where are they co-located at? Where the greatest inequities exist? Title I public schools. So what we have learned and seen, and Mary Helen was speaking of this too, is that there have been really great community schools that have created the processes that engage people on a consistent basis for continuous improvement cycle development. So it's become what I hear Brewer saying also, and where the struggle has been even during this past year with those community schools that are doing a good job of that already, is that the system needs to catch up to create an ecosystem, where multiple schools that are operating as Brewer described, where there is a person whose job it is to wake up every day, bring people together on a regular basis, think through and co-design together, and then coordinate their activities so they become more efficient, but they also become more effective getting the outcomes that they're looking for the well-being of their community, that can then inform. Thomas Jefferson said, the strength of strong democracy depends on a well-informed electorate. So imagine if every Title I school operated that way. So we just need a person whose job it is to think that way. It may be a person in position principal, superintendent, who just allows and supports that type of thinking. So that's some leadership mind shifts as well too. So the practical is not far out of reach. It's that mindset that we have been talking about, and then that person to be able to do it. So policy-wise, you know, I'd love to see on the BLS one day, community school coordinator.
This is the job that you're describing, right?
Right, the community school coordinator is what we call. I would love to see in a BLS. Then we'll know how many there are. We know how much they get paid. We better see inequities in that pay. We could do something about that. But then we could then codify what the core functions of that role is, not to just do program and hand out stuff. It's about pulling people together for a regenerative community design development. And I say development because that means you're progressing. But it has to be regenerative, because the positions will leave. You know, we value our teachers, we value our principals, we value our partners, but they will retire, they will move on, they will move out. But we want the community, and I'm guilty of it. I'm a kid raised by a single mom with 4 kids on the south side of Chicago. I got better and left my community. We want people to have to feel like they have to leave their community. We want them to be a part of their community. So I'm guilty of that. My old elementary school is now Higgins Community Academy. It wasn't that before. I hope to see that now on the south side of Chicago. We want people to be able to stay. So we should see numbers like mobility getting more steady. We should see what schools want to see, attendance and enrollment be more steady. Dollars comes with that, be more steady. But those are only lagging indicators of the sense of belonging Brewer and Mary Helen were talking about, the sense of collaboration. Our young people tell us that community schools should be about building these youth adult partnerships.
Thank you for closing out this panel there, Jose, with those remarks. That was really quite a beautiful vision that you articulated. And thank you to Brewer and Mary Helen for your comments as well. You guys are scholars who are also very practical, and it's a joy for a journalist to moderate a panel with the likes of you all. And thank you to Pedro for bringing us all together. Thank you to every single person who attended. Your questions were just incredibly grounding and provocative. So the panelists are now going to turn off our videos and say goodbye and hand it over to you, Pedro, for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you all, panelists, and thank you again, Elizabeth. You've been a terrific host and moderator. The discussion was so rich and stimulating. It gave us all a lot to think about. This is a moment that we're in when we have a chance to do things better than before. And we can't allow the lack of money to be the issue. We have to be resourceful, we have to be creative, because we know that the cost of failure are also quite steep and significant. So I encourage those of you who are able to tune in to stay in touch. We will have another webinar in the next few weeks. This one focused much more directly on issues of equity and expanding educational opportunities for those who have historically been least likely to receive them. So stay tuned. And we will be in touch. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to engaging you again in the near future.